The commanding general's voice cracked like a whip across the staging ground. 10 minutes! We have 10 minutes, and you're telling me this heap of Soviet steel is dead? The young sergeant stammered something about fuel injection, about electrical systems, about needing diagnostic equipment that didn't exist for a vehicle built in 1944. The general wasn't listening. He was staring at the silent T-34-85 tank that was supposed to lead the Victory Day parade, the crown jewel of the entire celebration, now sitting cold and lifeless while 30,000 spectators waited on the other side of the gate. Behind him, almost invisible in the chaos, an old man in a stained apron watched from beside a massive field kitchen. He had been stirring borscht for the post-parade reception. Now he set down his ladle, wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better decades, and began walking toward the tank. No one noticed him. They were too busy panicking. But what he did next silenced every voice on that staging ground. If this story moves you, type respect in the comments. Because when everyone else had given up, one old cook proved that some knowledge never dies. Viktor Ivanovich Kozlov had been stirring soup at military functions for 23 years. He was 74 years old, with hands like weathered oak and a face that had been carved by winters most of these young soldiers couldn't imagine. He wore the same stained apron he had worn for the past decade, the same heavy boots that had carried him through more kitchens than he could count, the same quiet expression that most people mistook for simple-mindedness. The officers who passed his field kitchen never looked twice at him. The soldiers who lined up for his food called him Dedushka and forgot his name as soon as they walked away. He was furniture, background. The old man who made the soup while more important people did more important things. That was exactly how Victor preferred it. Attention made him uncomfortable. Questions about his past made him change the subject. He had spent half a century building a life of deliberate invisibility, and he intended to keep it that way until they put him in the ground. But today, watching those young mechanics destroy an engine he knew better than his own heartbeat, Victor felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in decades. Something that wouldn't let him stand by and watch. The staging ground of the Sevastopol Victory Day parade was controlled chaos at the best of times. This year, the 75th anniversary of the Great Patriotic War's end, the pressure was immense. Dignitaries from 12 nations were seated in the reviewing stands. Television cameras from around the world were positioned along the parade route, and the centerpiece of the entire event, the lovingly restored T-34-85 that had actually seen combat at the Battle of Berlin, was supposed to roll through those gates in exactly 9 minutes, leading a column of vehicles that represented the triumph of a generation. Sergeant First Class Dmitry Volkov, head of the Vehicle Maintenance Unit, was experiencing the worst moment of his professional career. He had spent 3 months preparing this tank. He had personally overseen every system check, every fluid replacement, every mechanical inspection. The T-34 had performed flawlessly during rehearsals. And now, 10 minutes before the most important parade of the decade, the engine had simply stopped. No warning, no gradual failure. Just silence where there should have been the beautiful thunder of a V234 diesel engine. Volkov's team swarmed over the tank like ants on a dying animal. They were good mechanics, trained on the latest military vehicles, comfortable with computerized diagnostics and electronic fuel injection, and systems that told you exactly what was wrong through error codes and sensor readouts. But the T-34 had none of those things. The T-34 was a beast from another era, a machine built to be repaired in muddy fields by exhausted soldiers using whatever tools they could scavenge. Its simplicity had been its greatest strength in 1944. Now, in the hands of mechanics who had never known a world without diagnostic computers, that simplicity had become an impenetrable mystery. "Check the fuel lines again," Volkov ordered, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "Maybe there's a blockage." His corporal shook his head. "We checked twice. Fuel is flowing. Then it's electrical, the starter relay. The relay's fine. We tested it. Then what? What is it?" The corporal had no answer. None of them did. They were drowning in an ocean of analog technology, searching for digital solutions that didn't exist. General Andrei Mikhailovich Petrov arrived at the staging ground like a storm front rolling in from the sea. He was a decorated officer with 30 years of service, a reputation for perfectionism, and a complete intolerance for failure. The mayor of Sevastopol was in the reviewing stand. The defense minister was watching. Foreign military attachés were about to witness a catastrophic embarrassment that would be remembered for years. Petrov's career flashed before his eyes as he surveyed the scene. Mechanics arguing, officers shouting into radios, and the magnificent T-34 sitting silent as a tomb. "Sergeant Volkov," the general's voice cut through the noise like a blade. "Explain to me why this tank is not moving." Volkov snapped to attention, his face pale. "Sir, the engine died approximately 7 minutes ago. We've checked all primary systems. The fuel is reaching the cylinders. The electrical system appears functional, but the engine will not turn over. We believe—" "You believe nothing useful, apparently." Petrov checked his watch. 8 minutes. "Get it running. I don't care how. Push it if you have to." But pushing a 32-ton tank was not an option, and everyone knew it. The parade was dead. The humiliation was inevitable. Victor had watched all of this from beside his field kitchen, his hand still holding the rag he had used to wipe borscht from his fingers. He knew what was wrong with that tank. He had known from the moment he heard the engine cough and die, a sound as familiar to him as his own breathing. This starter motor solenoid valve, a known weakness in the V2 diesel, particularly in engines that had been restored with reproduction parts. The valve would stick after sitting idle for extended periods, especially in warm weather. The solution was simple if you knew what to look for. The problem was that no one here knew. The mechanics were looking for complex problems because they came from a world of complex machines. They couldn't imagine that a tank engine might be defeated by something as primitive as a stuck valve that needed nothing more than a firm blow from a heavy wrench. Victor set down his rag. He shouldn't get involved. He had built his entire post-war life around not getting involved, around being invisible, around letting the past stay buried where it belonged. But that tank, that beautiful, stubborn, magnificent machine that had carried men like him through the worst years of human history. He couldn't let her die in silence. Not like this. Not on Victory Day. He walked toward the tank with the slow, deliberate gait of a man who was in no hurry because he knew exactly what needed to be done. The chaos swirled around him, officers shouting, mechanics arguing, the general's voice rising to a pitch that suggested imminent career destruction for everyone involved. No one noticed the old cook approaching the hulking steel beast. Why would they? He was nobody. He stirred soup. He peeled potatoes. He was invisible. Victor reached the side of the tank and placed one weathered hand on the armor plating, still warm from the morning sun. 60 years of memories flooded through him in an instant. The smell of diesel and cordite, the screaming of shells overhead, the faces of young men who never came home. He pushed the memories down, the way he had pushed them down every day since 1945, and began to climb the hull. His joints protested, his back ached, but his hands remembered where to grip, his feet remembered where to step, and before anyone could stop him, he was standing on the engine deck of a T-34 for the first time in more than half a century. A lieutenant named Osinov was the first to notice. "Hey, what do you think you're doing? Get down from there!" Victor ignored him. He was already lifting the engine access hatch, his eyes scanning the familiar landscape of pipes and cylinders and mechanical components that had once been as natural to him as his own body. "Someone get this old fool off the tank," Osinov shouted. "We don't need a cook contaminating the engine." 2 soldiers moved toward the tank, ready to drag Victor down by force. But before they could reach him, Sergeant Volkov raised a hand. Something in the old man's movements had caught his attention. The way he opened the hatch, the way his eyes moved across the engine, the way his hands hovered over components with the unconscious familiarity of long experience. This wasn't a confused old man who had wandered into the wrong place. This was something else entirely. "Wait," Volkov said. "Let him look." Lieutenant Osinov stared at him incredulously. "Sergeant, we have 6 minutes until—" "I said wait." Victor didn't acknowledge the argument below him. He was already deep in conversation with the engine, a dialogue conducted entirely through sight and sound and smell. The fuel lines were clear. He could tell from the slight shimmer of diesel in the primer bulb. The electrical connections were solid. The corrosion patterns showed recent cleaning. The cylinders weren't flooded despite what the mechanics had feared. The exhaust ports were dry, which meant the problem was exactly what he had suspected. He leaned closer to the starter assembly, his ear almost touching the metal, and tapped the solenoid housing with his knuckle. The sound that came back was wrong. A dull thunk instead of a clear ring. Stuck. The valve was stuck in the closed position, preventing the starter from engaging properly. He had seen this 100 times during the war, when tanks would sit idle for days between battles and then refuse to start when the order came to advance. The solution then was the same as the solution now. Victor looked up and called down to the nearest mechanic. "Wrench, heavy one, 24mm. The mechanic blinked at him. "What?" "Wrench, now." Something in Victor's voice, a quality of absolute authority that had nothing to do with rank and everything to do with competence, made the mechanic reach for his tool bag without further question. He tossed a heavy wrench up to the old man, who caught it with one hand as if he had been catching wrenches all his life. Victor positioned himself over the starter assembly, judged the angle and delivered a single, precise blow to the solenoid housing. The clang of metal on metal rang across the staging ground. Every head turned. General Petrov pushed through the crowd, his face purple with fury. "What in the name of... Who authorized this man to... What is he doing to my tank?" Victor didn't answer. He was already moving to the manual primer, working the handle with practiced efficiency to clear any air from the fuel lines. He leaned close to the exhaust manifold and inhaled, checking the fuel-to-air mixture by smell alone, the way he had learned to do when gauges were luxuries that frontline tanks couldn't afford. Too rich. The mechanics had been flooding the engine in their panic, dumping too much fuel into cylinders that couldn't process it. Victor reached down and adjusted the manual mixture control, a small brass lever that the restoration team had kept functional, but that no one present knew how to use. He pulled it back 2 notches, leaned close to the engine again, inhaled, and nodded to himself. Better. Not perfect, but good enough. The old diesels were forgiving if you knew how to talk to them. "You," he called to the driver, a young private who had been standing uselessly beside the hull, waiting for someone to tell him what to do. "Get in. When I signal, crank it. Full power, don't hesitate." The driver looked at General Petrov for approval. The general, too stunned to object, simply nodded. The driver scrambled into the hull and positioned himself at the controls. Victor made one final check of the engine compartment, his hands moving over components with the tenderness of a man greeting an old friend. He closed the access hatch, positioned himself on the rear deck, and raised his hand. The staging ground fell silent. Every eye was on the old cook standing atop a 60-year-old tank, his stained apron flapping slightly in the breeze, his weathered face calm with absolute certainty. 3 minutes until parade time. If this didn't work, nothing would. Victor brought his hand down. The driver hit the starter. For one heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, from deep within the steel beast, came a cough, a rumble, a grinding roar that built and built until it erupted from the exhaust stacks in a massive plume of black smoke that rose toward the sky like a declaration of war against everything that had tried to silence this magnificent machine. The engine caught. The engine held. The V234 diesel thundered to life with a sound that shook the ground beneath their feet, a sound that Victor hadn't heard in 60 years, but that he would have recognized in his sleep, in his death, in whatever came after. The T-34 was alive, and she was angry about being made to wait. The mechanic stumbled backward from the sheer force of the engine's resurrection. General Petrov's mouth hung open, his fury forgotten in the face of something that looked very much like a miracle. Lieutenant Usinov, who had wanted Victor dragged off the tank like a trespassing vagrant, stood frozen with an expression of complete incomprehension. Only Sergeant Volkov moved, pushing through the crowd to stand beside the tank, looking up at the old man who had done in 3 minutes what his entire team couldn't accomplish in 10. "How?" he shouted over the engine noise. "How did you know?" Victor climbed down from the hull with the same surprising agility he had shown going up. His joints would punish him tomorrow, but right now adrenaline and memory were carrying him through. He landed on the ground, straightened his apron, and picked up the wrench he had dropped during the descent. He held it out to Volkov, handle first. "She likes it rough," he said, his voice barely audible over the diesel roar. "Don't flood her next time, and that solenoid needs replacing. Reproduction part. They always stick." General Petrov finally found his voice. "Who is this man? Someone tell me who this man is." A colonel on his staff was already checking identification records on a tablet, scrolling through the personnel files for the catering unit. "Viktor Ivanovich Kozlov, sir. Civilian contractor. He's been doing field kitchen work for military events since 2001. Before that..." The colonel paused, frowning at the screen. "Before that, his records are incomplete. There's a reference to military service, but the details are classified. Victor was already walking back toward his field kitchen, his soup ladle waiting where he had left it. But the general's next words stopped him in his tracks. Kozlov. Viktor Ivanovich Kozlov. Petrov was staring at him with an expression that mixed confusion with something else, something that looked almost like recognition. I know that name. I've seen it somewhere. A commendation list. No. A memorial wall. No. The general's eyes widened. The Museum of the Armoured Forces, in Kubinka, the Hall of Heroes, there's a photograph, a young tank commander, Viktor Kozlov, the Wolf of Kursk. The staging ground, already buzzing with activity as crews prepared the now-running T-34 for its parade debut, went quiet again. The Wolf of Kursk. Even the youngest soldiers knew that name, though most assumed it belonged to history, to legend, to someone who had died decades ago. Viktor Kozlov, tank commander of the 5th Guards Tank Army, the man who had destroyed 11 German tanks in a single engagement during the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in human history. The man who had led his company through the hell of Operation Bagration, liberating village after village across Belorussia. The man who had driven a T-34-85 through the streets of Berlin in April 1945, one of the first Soviet tanks to reach the Reichstag. The Wolf of Kursk was a hero of the Soviet Union. He was a legend. He was, according to every official record, supposed to have died in 1946 from wounds sustained in the war. But he was also apparently standing in front of a field kitchen in a stained apron, looking like he very much wished everyone would forget what they had just heard. Victor stood perfectly still, his face unreadable, as the weight of 70 years of deliberate anonymity crumbled around him. He had worked so hard to disappear. After the war, after the parades and the medals and the speeches that meant nothing to men who had watched their friends burn alive inside steel coffins, he had wanted only silence. Only peace. Only a life where no one looked at him and saw the boy who had killed so many, even if they had been enemies, even if it had been necessary. He had changed his documents, moved to a small village, married a woman who never asked about the scars on his hands or the nightmares that woke him screaming. He had raised children who knew their father only as a quiet man who was good with engines and who cooked the best borscht in the region. When the Soviet Union fell and records were scattered, he had slipped through the cracks entirely, becoming just another old man in a country full of old men whose stories no one wanted to hear anymore. And now, because of a stuck solenoid valve and a tank that wouldn't let him walk away, all of it was coming undone. General Petrov approached him slowly, as if approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. "Viktor Ivanovich, is it true? Are you the Wolf of Kursk?" Viktor was silent for a long moment. Then, with the weariness of a man who had been carrying a weight for far too long, he nodded. "I was, a long time ago. Another life." The general looked at the T-34, now rumbling contentedly as its driver prepared to move it into parade position. "That tank, the one we just restored, it's from the 5th Guards Tank Army. It was at Kursk, at Berlin." He turned back to Viktor. "Did you ever—" Viktor's eyes met his, and in them the general saw something that no training manual could teach, that no simulation could replicate. The eyes of a man who had seen the worst that human beings could do to each other, and had somehow survived to tell about it. "Her name was Maria," Viktor said quietly, "named after my sister. I drove her from Prokhorovka to the Reichstag. 2,000 kilometers, 18 months. She took 7 hits that should have killed us. She brought her crew home every time." He looked at the tank, and for just a moment his weathered face softened into something that looked almost like love. "I wondered what happened to her after they took her away for the museum." The parade was now 4 minutes overdue, but no one was moving. The soldiers, the mechanics, the officers who had been shouting orders moments ago, all stood in silence as the truth of what they were witnessing settled over them. This wasn't just an old cook who happened to know about engines. This was a living connection to history, a direct line to the men who had bled and died to give them the victory they were about to celebrate. Sergeant Volkov stepped forward, his eyes wet. "Sir, the Wolf of Kursk, I wrote a paper about you in military academy, your tactics at Prokhorovka, the way you used terrain to neutralize the Tiger's range advantage. You were a genius." Viktor shook his head. "I was a boy who didn't want to die. The rest was just survival, luck, the men beside me, the machine beneath me." He gestured toward the T-34. "She did the hard part. I just pointed her in the right direction." General Petrov made a decision. It was impulsive, possibly a violation of several protocols and absolutely certain to create paperwork nightmares for his staff. He didn't care. Some moments were bigger than paperwork. "Viktor Ivanovich Kozlov," he said, his voice carrying across the staging ground with the formal weight of command. "You drove this tank through Berlin 75 years ago. You saved her today. I am asking you, on behalf of the Russian armed forces and the people of Sevastopol, to drive her one more time. Lead the parade, take your place in history." The crowd held its breath. Victor looked at the tank, at the open driver's hatch where a young private was waiting uncertainly, at the column of vehicles lined up behind her ready to roll. He looked at his apron, stained with borscht and decades of deliberate obscurity. He looked at his hands, scarred and weathered, hands that had killed and healed and hidden in equal measure, and then slowly he began to unbutton his apron. The young driver practically leaped out of the hatch as Victor approached. Someone produced a tanker's helmet from the museum collection, the original leather style with the padded brow that Victor remembered from a lifetime ago. It was too small, made for the head of a younger man, but he pulled it on anyway. He climbed the hull one more time, his joints screaming, his heart pounding, and lowered himself through the driver's hatch into a seat that felt like coming home. The controls were exactly where they had always been. The pedals, the levers, the smell of diesel and metal that no amount of restoration could ever quite replicate. Victor placed his hands on the steering levers, and for a moment he was 20 years old again, terrified and determined, driving through smoke and fire toward an enemy that wanted him dead. But the enemy was gone now. The smoke was gone. All that remained was a sunny day in Sevastopol, a crowd of 30,000 people waiting to cheer, and an old tank that had one more parade left in her. Victor engaged the clutch. The T-34 lurched forward, then smoothed out as muscle memory took over. He guided her through the staging area, past the stunned mechanics who had given up on her, past General Petrov, who stood at attention as she passed, past the field kitchen where his borscht was probably burning, but where he found he didn't care at all. The gates to the parade route swung open before him, and suddenly he was bathed in sunlight, in cheering, in the roar of 30,000 voices welcoming the lead vehicle of the Victory Day parade. He couldn't see them through the narrow driver's slit, but he could hear them, and the sound washed over him like a wave of something he hadn't felt in decades. Gratitude, recognition, love. Not for Viktor Kozlov the cook, not even for Viktor Kozlov the Wolf of Kursk, but for all of them. All the boys who had climbed into tanks like this one and never climbed out. All the crew members who had burned so that their country could survive. All the ghosts who rode beside him even now, filling the empty seats of a machine that had carried so many to their deaths and somehow kept carrying on. The parade route was 2 kilometers long, but Victor experienced it as a series of impressions rather than a coherent journey. Faces in the crowd, some young, some old, some weeping openly. Children sitting on their parents' shoulders, waving flags at the magnificent steel beast rumbling past. Veterans in wheelchairs, their hands raised in salutes that Victor returned through the open hatch, his own hand trembling with the weight of shared memory. Camera crews from a dozen countries, capturing footage that would circle the world within hours, and above it all the beautiful, terrible roar of an engine that had refused to die, just as the men who built her had refused to die, just as the country they defended had refused to die. When he reached the end of the route, Victor brought the tank to a stop in front of the main reviewing stand, exactly as the driver was supposed to do, and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. Mayor Sergei Konstantinov stood in the reviewing stand staring at the T-34 with an expression of complete confusion. He had been briefed on the parade order. A young private was supposed to be driving the lead tank. Instead, an old man in a leather helmet was climbing out of the hatch, moving with the careful deliberation of ancient joints, and the crowd was going absolutely insane. The defense minister leaned over and whispered something in the mayor's ear. The mayor's eyes widened. He grabbed a microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, citizens of Sevastopol, I have just been informed of an extraordinary development." His voice echoed across the square, cutting through the cheering. "The man who just drove that tank through our streets is not a young soldier. He is Viktor Ivanovich Kozlov. He is 74 years old, and 75 years ago he drove that very same tank through the streets of Berlin as we claimed our victory. The crowd erupted into a sound that Victor would remember for the rest of his life. They helped him down from the tank, surrounded him with generals and dignitaries who wanted to shake his hand, bombarded him with questions about his service, his survival, his decades of anonymity. Victor answered as briefly as he could, deflecting attention whenever possible, uncomfortable with the spotlight that he had spent half a century avoiding. But there was one moment that he would treasure above all others. As the official ceremonies wound down, as the crowds began to disperse and the tanks were prepared for transport back to their museums and depots, a young corporal approached him. The same corporal who had been desperately trying to fix the engine that morning. His name tag read Volkov, and Victor realized this was the sergeant's nephew, just beginning his career in military maintenance. "Sir," the corporal said, his voice barely steady, "I wanted to apologize. This morning, when we couldn't start the tank, I thought I knew what I was doing. I thought my training was enough, but I didn't know anything." Victor studied the young man's face, seeing in it the same uncertainty, the same hunger to prove himself that he had felt at that age, before the war, before everything. "You knew enough to stand back when you realized you didn't know enough," Victor said. "That's more important than you think. Pride kills more tanks than enemy shells." He placed a weathered hand on the corporal's shoulder. "These machines, they're not computers. They don't follow rules. They have personalities, moods. You have to learn to listen to them, not just diagnose them. Spend time with her. Learn her sounds. Learn her smells. When she's happy, she'll tell you. When she's angry, she'll tell you that too, but you have to be paying attention." The corporal nodded, hanging on every word. "Will you teach me? I mean, if you have time, if you're willing. I want to learn the way you learned, the real way, not just from manuals." Victor was silent for a moment. For 50 years he had refused to teach, refused to share, refused to let anyone connect him to the past he had worked so hard to bury. But standing here, in the shadow of a tank that had carried him through hell and back, he felt that resistance crumbling. "Come to my kitchen tomorrow morning," he said finally. "Bring coffee, strong coffee. We'll start with the engine. By the time I'm done with you, you'll be able to start a T-34 blindfolded in a snowstorm with nothing but a wrench and a prayer." The corporal's face split into a grin that reminded Victor of his own crew, young men who had smiled just like that in the moments between battles, who had believed in their own immortality right up until the moment they weren't immortal anymore. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down." Victor watched him walk away, then turned back to the tank. The engine was cool now, silent, resting after her moment in the sun. He placed his hand on the armor one more time, feeling the warmth of the metal, and whispered something that no one else could hear. General Petrov found him there a few minutes later, still standing beside the tank, lost in a conversation with ghosts. "Viktor Ivanovich, the defense minister would like to speak with you. There's talk of official recognition, a ceremony, perhaps even a return to the Hall of Heroes." Victor shook his head slowly. "I've had enough ceremonies for one lifetime, General. I was happy being invisible. I'm still not sure I shouldn't go back to it." Petrov considered this, then nodded. "I understand. But whether you want it or not, what happened today will not stay quiet. The footage is already everywhere. By tonight, the whole country will know your name again." Victor sighed, a sound that carried the weight of 70 years. "Then let them know it. But let them also know this. I'm not a hero. I was a boy in a machine doing what I had to do to survive. The heroes are the ones who didn't come back. Alexei, my driver, who took a round meant for me at Minsk. Sasha, my gunner, who burned at Königsberg. Yuri, my loader, who held his guts in with his hands for 3 hours until we reached a medic and then died anyway." His voice cracked slightly. "They're the heroes. I'm just the one who got lucky enough to keep living." That evening, Victor returned to his small apartment in the workers' district of Sevastopol. His borscht had indeed burned in his absence, and the field kitchen staff had covered for him with emergency rations from the backup supplies. He would hear about it from the catering manager tomorrow, but he found he didn't mind. Some things were worth a burned pot of soup. He sat by his window as the sun went down, watching the fireworks explode over the harbour in celebration of Victory Day. In his lap, he held a small wooden box that he hadn't opened in decades. Inside were 4 photographs, faded to the point of near invisibility. Alexei, Sasha, Yuri and Victor himself standing beside a T-34 that was covered in mud and blood and the kind of desperate hope that only soldiers understand. They were smiling. They were young. They had no idea what was coming. He touched each face gently. the way he had touched the armour of the tank that morning, and felt tears running down his cheeks for the first time in longer than he could remember. The next morning, Corporal Volkov arrived at Victor's field kitchen at 6 o'clock sharp, carrying 2 thermoses of coffee strong enough to strip paint. Victor was already there, apron on, ladle in hand, stirring a fresh pot of borscht as if the previous day had never happened. But when he saw the young man approaching, he set down the ladle and smiled, a rare expression that transformed his weathered face into something almost warm. "Good. You're on time. First lesson. A tank waits for no one, and neither does breakfast." He gestured toward a table where a series of engine parts had been laid out, each one cleaned and labelled. "Second lesson. Before you can fix a machine, you have to understand it. Not just how it works, why it works." The men who designed the T-34 were geniuses, but they were also desperate. Every choice they made was a compromise between what they wanted and what they could actually build in a factory that was being bombed every night. Once you understand their desperation, you'll understand the machine. Corporal Volkov sat down, pulled out a notebook and began to write. 3 months later, at a small ceremony that Viktor insisted be kept private, the Russian Ministry of Defense officially reinstated Viktor Ivanovich Kozlov to the Active Veterans Registry and presented him with every commendation he had declined to accept since 1945. He wore his old uniform for the first time in 70 years, and it still fit, mostly because he had never stopped doing the physical labour that had kept him alive through 6 years of war. The Wolf of Kursk stood at attention one more time, received his medals one more time, and then quietly requested that everyone please forget about him and let him get back to his soup. They didn't forget. They never would. But they respected his wishes enough to stop asking for interviews, to stop filming documentaries, to let an old man finish his days in the peace he had earned. The only addition to his routine was the weekly teaching session with Corporal Volkov, which eventually expanded to include 6 other young mechanics who wanted to learn the old ways, who wanted to understand machines the way Victor understood them, with instinct and intuition and love. On the anniversary of his death, 18 months later, the maintenance unit of the Sevastopol military district held a memorial service at the field kitchen where Victor had spent his final years. Corporal Volkov, now Sergeant Volkov, spoke briefly about what the old cook had taught him. Not just about engines, though he had taught plenty about those, but about humility, about listening, about understanding that the past has wisdom that the present cannot replace, about knowing when to step forward and when to stay invisible, and about having the courage to do both when the moment demanded it. The T-34-85 that Victor had resurrected was present at the service, brought from the museum specifically for the occasion. Her engine ran perfectly. It had never given anyone trouble since that Victory Day morning, when an old cook had shown a generation of mechanics what they had forgotten. If this story reminded you that expertise doesn't expire, that quiet people often carry the loudest histories, and that sometimes the most important person in the room is the one no one notices, subscribe to this channel. Because this is what we do here. We find the people that history forgot. We tell the stories that deserve to be heard, and we never ever underestimate the man stirring the soup.